contains references to scientific experiments involving mice and rats. It also includes a graphic story about a client who was self-harming by cutting herself. If you are sensitive to either topic in any way, we recommend you choose not to listen.
Welcome back to the Collective Trauma Online Summit. My name is Laura Calderón de la Barca, and I am one of the hosts of this summit. And today we are happy to receive inherited family trauma specialist, Mark Wallyn. Mark is the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco and is a leading expert in the field of inherited family trauma. He is a sought-after lecturer and teaches at hospital, clinics, conferences, universities, and teaching centers around the world, including the University of Pittsburgh, the Western Psychiatric Institute, Kripalu, the Omega Institute, the New York Open Center, 1440 Multiversity, JFK University, and the California Institute of Integral Studies. Mark specializes in working with a variety of significant challenges such as depression, anxiety, obsessive thoughts, fears, panic disorders, self-injury, chronic pain, and persistent symptoms and conditions. His book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, is the winner of the 2016 Silver Nautilus Book Award in Psychology and has been translated into 19 languages. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Mind Body Green, mariashriver.com, Elephant Journal, and Psych Central. And his poetry has been published in The New Yorker. And today, Mark will be sharing with us about breaking the cycle of inherited family trauma. A warm welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Laura. I'm happy to be here.
So to start off our conversation, I'd like to share with you a question we've been asking all our guests. And that is, in the context of your work, how do you see the effects of intergenerational and collective trauma? And how do you work on healing them?
Right. So first off, how can we not be connected? And then how can we not be affected by it? For instance, when we even look at what we're all experiencing now, the collective trauma of the pandemic, it's shaken a container that we all share, set fire to it, so to speak. And in that heat, our own unhealed, unresolved personal traumas begin to simmer, maybe even boil over. And that's a place we can focus on our personal traumas and the impact that they have on our children and our grandchildren, how we inherit the molecular changes, specifically the stress responses, the unconscious reactions, the gene expressions of our parents and grandparents who've suffered. So the way I heal collective trauma, one of the ways we can heal collective trauma is to heal our own personal traumas. It goes without saying, but we've got to do our own personal work. Heal what's in shadow, integrate what's fragmented in us, how we've numbed out, how we've shut down, how we've split off, how we've tightened not to feel something. Then, from a place of more clarity, when we can self-regulate, we can take action and do meaningful deeds, create a meaningful impact in the world. When we're clear, we can focus on what we're meant to do in life, doing what we enjoy, what energizes us, doing what's truly meaningful, and then we can be of service to others and of service in the world. I think maybe there's one thing more I want to say about that. Before we can become truly inclusive of others, we've got to include what's ugly inside ourselves, the ugly parts that we've excluded. Our inhumanity toward others is a mirror of our own inhumanity toward ourselves. When we're split inside, we can do terrible things to ourselves, to others, However, when we treat ourselves with respect and dignity, how can we treat others any differently?
Right, right. There is so much in what you said, and I would like to start by asking you about, you mentioned the molecules that get passed on. So could you, I know there's been a lot of research, and that's part of what's present in your book, one of the contributions, that you bring together information about the most recent research on trauma transmission through the epigenetic systems. Could you share a bit with us about, what you know about that? What are the contributions that science has made to this field?
Yeah. So just at even the basis level, when a trauma happens to us, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, a chemical tag will attach to the DNA and then tell the cells, hey, because of this terrible thing that's just happened to us, use these genes or ignore these genes, activate, silence, turn up, turn down this genetic material to help us deal with what just happened. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or how we feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to an original trauma, even if that original trauma occurred in a past generation to our parents and grandparents, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. I'll give an example. If our parents come from a war-torn country, let's say there's bombs going off, bullets flying, uniformed men lining people up in the street, people being taken away, people being shot, killed, we don't hear from them again. Our grandparents living this trauma would adapt, epigenetically adapt biologically in their bodies. In other words, they might adapt, is a word I like to use, but they might their behaviors begin to change. For example, they're developing internally a skill set, sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence to help them survive this trauma they experienced. The problem is they're passing that skill set down, and here we are not born in a war-torn environment, inheriting a stress response with the dials set to 10, and here we are preparing for this war, which never arrives. And we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression is connected to our parents and grandparents. We just think we're wired this way. We walk around thinking, well, this is just the way I am, Laura, without ever making these links and these gene changes that we inherit, this gene expression. We're now learning this is what's passed on to our children and also to our grandchildren.
Right. And in what you just mentioned, Mark, there is the construction of identity, where we construct our identity around the trauma. And it seems to me that there is a very core piece around being able to not form an identity around the trauma. And I would love to ask a bit more, how do you see that? And how do you contribute to that de-identification from the trauma in the work that you do?
So the identification of the trauma lives everywhere. It lives in, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, in our trauma language, our what we say, our verbal trauma language, our nonverbal trauma language, our behaviors, our destructive behaviors. And we need to separate from this identification. I love the word. I think it's the exact right word, but it's unconscious to us. We don't even have a clue that this is an identification. We just think this is how we are. And again, we've got to slow things down so we can go internal, so we can look at our reactivity, look at our, I teach people in the book that you've read, the book I've written, how to listen to this trauma language, because we might not have even identified this trauma language as being part of this family or collective or historical trauma that we carry. For example, somebody can be walking around with a sentence, and I hear this all the time, I don't deserve to live, or I deserve to die, or I'll go crazy, or I'll be locked up, or I'll do something terrible, I'll hurt a child. And we never think to separate ourselves from this sort of moving, breathing, out of body experience, because at that point we're disembodied, we're disintegrated. We need to integrate and pull together the fragmented core until we have a flowing, flexible yet solid core inside that we can begin to identify with, rather than these fragmentations that we've identified with.
Right. So could you give us some examples so that we can be able to see what this actually looks like in reality? It seems to me it's easier than for one to say, oh, that's what you're talking about.
I have so many stories to tell. I think what I'm going to do for this, I think I'm going to talk about the very first case that led me to look for inherited family trauma. Now, this goes back 25, 26, 27 years ago. I'm working with cutters during this time, self-injurers. And I'm working with this one woman who is 24 years old, but she cuts in a little bit of a different way than the other cutters I'm working with who are cutting more superficially. She cuts in a way so deeply that she cuts a vessel. She cuts a vein, an artery, and she nearly bleeds to death. And her parents have to rush her to the hospital so she doesn't die. And this is what happens repeatedly. She's cut herself. She begins to bleed profusely, nearly bleeds to death. Her parents take her to the hospital. She's locked in a psych ward for 3-4 weeks at a time. And one day, when I'm working with her, she gets out of the psych ward. I hand her a pen and I say to her, I'll call her Sarah for the interview. I say, hey, Sarah, take this pen, put it to your arm, and show me what happens, what's happening, what the impulse is, what the urge is, what the sensation is, what the thought is, what the feeling is, what you're experiencing in that exact moment. So she begins to put the pen to her arm, and in that moment, I see her glaze over, and she begins to disintegrate. And I say, right there, what's that feeling? What's that thought? And she looks at me and says, I deserve to die. I don't deserve to live. And obviously I say, what did you do? What have you done, Sarah? Did you cause an accident? Did you take a life accidentally? Did you break up with somebody who killed himself or herself? And she says, no, nothing like that. I mean, here I am looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. Shouldn't do anything. And I knew back then what I always knew, how to look at the childhood, how to look at the relationship with the parents, how to look at attachment. I did not know at that time how to look at generational trauma. So I look at her childhood, and her relationship with her parents is beautiful. She's able to receive the love and nurturance and care from her mother, the tenderness from her father, the love and the care. I look at the attachment with her mother. It's safe, secure, strong. I'm flummoxed. So luckily, something in me knew to ask this question back then. I said, okay, tell me about your grandparents. And boom, she drops the bomb. Now, her grandmother, her father's mother, was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk, and grandpa was in the front seat, and she crashed into a telephone pole. She lived, but grandpa went through the windshield, got cut, lacerated on the glass, and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And in that moment, she told the whole story in her verbal and nonverbal trauma language. She told the story of, I bleed to death, which is I have this behavior where I cut myself and I bleed to death if somebody doesn't stop the blood flow. and I deserve to die, which in that minute we both realized was not her feeling. So thank goodness I was a student of psychodrama back then. I put 2 chairs out in the middle of the office, and I said, Sarah, close your eyes and see your grandfather. Tell him what you do. And she said, Grandpa, who she never met because he dies when the father's 12 and the mother dies soon after of self-hatred and alcohol poisoning. She looks at her grandfather in the chair, closes her eyes and says, Grandpa, I cut myself. I say, tell him how you cut yourself. I cut myself so deeply, I nearly bleed to death. I say, add the words like you, Grandpa. And she says, like you, Grandpa. And she's now in her heart and in her tears. And I say, what's he showing you? What's he telling you? And she says, he's telling me he doesn't want me to suffer. And this isn't my sensation, my feeling, my experience. He tells me that when I go to cut, feel him there comforting me and supporting me, so I don't need to harm myself, that'll come in later. And then I have her turn to the other chair and say to her grandmother, Grandma, I have this feeling that I deserve to die. I don't deserve to live. And Grandma, I just understood that this is your feeling. You don't deserve to live. You deserve to die for taking a life, the life of your beloved. And all of a sudden, Grandma, I said, what's she showing you? She's showing me the same thing. She loves me. She's there as a support for me, that when I go home and I feel the urge to cut or the urge that I don't deserve to live, to feel her there with me. She goes home, never cuts again. Another part of the story is I have her bring her father in, and I do the same thing with her father in the chair, because he can't really grieve his father because the anger at his mother overshadows his grief. Because when he begins to grieve, he feels the anger of my mother, the alcoholic who took my father's life. So what was beautiful is I began a process that I would do later that I had no idea what I was learning. I said, look behind your grandmother. Look, why did she drink? And of course, he looks behind her and he goes, oh, well, I know this. She was given away at 3 years old to foster care. And I said, of course she drank. How could she not? She's missing the dopamine from her mother, who was able to give her away. So there must have been a break in the attachment. And all of a sudden, the father fills with compassion for his own mother, is able to grieve his father. And the beautiful thing in the session, he then turns to the side to Sarah, stands up organically and says, you know, Sarah, I've got this. You can leave this with me. You know, I tell this story because then my life unfolded where I meet Bert Hellinger and I become one of the first students of Bert Hellinger in the United States. And, you know, it goes on from there. But it was just a great, really grace that this session taught me to open my eyes.
Wow, that's a beautifully retold, very significant experience that so has shaped your work. And I would like to ask you, can you share with us more about this core language approach that you put together through your work with Bert and this experience and others?
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, so when a trauma happens, we're changed chemically, molecularly, biologically by the effects of the trauma. But when a trauma happens, we're also changed because there are clues of the trauma left behind, I've discovered in the form of emotionally charged words and language. Sentences that form a breadcrumb trail, that when we know how to follow this breadcrumb trail and start collecting the pieces, it's like finding the missing piece of the puzzle that allows the whole picture to come into view and finally gives us a context for why we feel why we feel the way we feel. So we know this from trauma theory. When a traumatic event happens, significant information of the trauma bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of exactly what happens to us in the trauma can't be named or ordered through words or language because our language centers become compromised. So without language to process what happens, our experiences get stored as fragments of energy, fragments of memory, fragments of body sensations, fragments of images of the trauma, fragments of language, which for me has a deep focus, fragments of emotions. It's like the mind disperses and essential elements get separated. We lose the story and never complete the healing, which is what happens with trauma. What I've discovered is the pieces aren't lost at all. They've simply been rerouted into our deep and submerged in the body, and then resurface in this verbal and nonverbal trauma language. When it's nonverbal, I've talked about verbal, you know, she says, I deserve to die, I don't deserve to live. That's our verbal trauma language. Or for us, I'll be abandoned, I'll be betrayed, I'll be annihilated, I won't exist, I won't matter. That's our verbal trauma language. But our nonverbal trauma language, we look for the physical and emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event that happens to us. We look for the fears and anxieties that strike, they can strike suddenly when we reach a particular age. And it's often the same age that something terrible happened in the family history. Or we look for a depression or a destructive behavior, a self-sabotaging behavior that shows up after a situation that's similar or reminiscent of a trauma in the family history. This nonverbal trauma language, it's mirrored in our relationship struggles with our partner, who we choose, the type of behaviors we accept, the type of behaviors we repeat. It's also mirrored in the ways we deal with money, success, abundance. You know, all of this forms a breadcrumb trail that we need to follow. I'll give a quick example that puts it both together of a person I worked with recently. You know, I recently worked with this woman who developed cancer a few months after her dog died. And I wanted to hear her verbal trauma language. So as we're talking, I'll call her Tony for the sake of this conversation. I said, Tony, tell me about this dog. And she said, oh, he was everything to me. I was with him for 16 years. He was absolutely everything to me. And I'm writing this down. And then when we go into her family history and we do her traumagram, we find out her mother's favorite brother was killed in a car accident when the mother was 16. This is the older brother. And this was, you know, she had been with him for 16 years, and this older brother was everything to her. And then when we looked further, her father, he was 16 also when his father had a massive stroke and died. And as an only child, she now carries the unresolved grief of both parents. And the verbal trauma language, I'm with him for 16 years, he was everything to me, applies to both sides of the family. And the nonverbal language is having symptoms arise after her dog dies. So when we begin to look at this map that we all are, you know, I call it a core language map, is, you know, I teach the reader in the book how to, you know, to expand and develop this core language map. We're a map of these traumas. Nothing's hidden. Everything homeopathically is living within and fragmented without. We can start to put the pieces together, and then we can begin to heal.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, Mark. And I'm very curious about, you've shared with us how this individual trauma language emerges. I'm wondering, is there an equivalent for collective trauma? Is there a collective trauma language that we can tune into in order to heal from other things? What is your take on that?
So as you know, I run the Family Constellation Institute, and in a family constellation, we're constantly working with collective trauma. So somebody experiences, and for me, again, my focus, I'm working through the personal trauma. So for me, you know, when I'm working with issues of slavery or issues of the Holocaust or the Armenian or Cambodian genocide. You know, I'm working directly with the family members of those who experienced harm, or those who caused harm, or those who witnessed harm, or those who felt guilty, or those who remained silent. Because as we know, the descendants of the victims and the perpetrators, you know, are equally affected. And then, of course, this all contributes to the frequency of the collective experience that we feel. So in a family constellation, for example, we're all holding this collective space and we all know something about it. Because if you go back long enough in our own personal histories, there isn't anything that isn't seen or felt or experienced. We might not know the cause or the events. We might not know the events, but certainly when we do this work, this family constellation work, there's this collective resonance and then a collective healing as we all sit with open hearts, holding a container for that container that's broken.
That's beautiful. And one question I have about that is, so there is a healing process for those people who have been, you know, who are the direct inheritors of, you know, these tragic events. And I'm also wondering, is there a healing for those participating that are also holding this space?
No doubt, because what's happening, we might not know the murderer in our family because it happened 7 or 6 generations ago. And as you know, I didn't talk much about the science. I can certainly go into the science, but we know there's a 3-generational link. But if you look, but then there's a repetition. So if, let me go into the physical science a little bit.
Please go ahead.
Because I think it'll be important here. And then, but first, let me give the answer to your question. Yes, yes, and yes, because we all have it in our personal histories. And even though the science goes back 3 generations, well, those might be repetitions 3 generations ago. And 6 generations ago, they might be repetitions of 9 generations ago. So you have this reverberation through the family history, and these events are lost. So yes, if I don't experience the Cambodian genocide personally, but I'm holding the space as this energy arises in the group, something in me also shifts, even though I'm not even aware of my personal trauma. But I want to go back into the science here. So we know with humans, they can, for 2 generations, we can, you know, because a generation, unfortunately, the science is new. This is 15 years ago that Rachel Yehuda comes into the mainstream and says, hey guys, I'm working with Holocaust trauma here, but I'm noticing something strange, that the Holocaust survivors and their children are both having the same trauma symptoms, specifically the low levels of cortisol, the stress hormone that gets us back together when something stressful happens. And you know, she's also the one that does the study during 9/11 when the buildings are attacked in New York. And she looked at pregnant mothers and who went on to have PTSD. And then, of course, their children had 16 genetic markers that were different, 15 genes that expressed differently than children who weren't born to pregnant mothers. And these babies were smaller than their gestational age. So she's turning on the light, you know, clicking the light saying, hey guys, there's more, there's, you know, she's one of the first people. And that tells us, one of the sentences I like that she says that is quite potent. You and I are 3 times more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if one of our parents had PTSD. And then as a result, we're likely to struggle with depression and anxiety. So the pattern, these patterns are observed for 2 generations. Because why 2? Because it takes 12 to 20 years to get a generation of humans. That's where mice come in. And importantly, my studies with mice show that you can observe these symptoms for 3 generations easily. And why mice? Because you can get a generation of mice in 12 to 20 weeks. And also mice and humans share a similar genetic makeup. Over 92, 93% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with over 80% being identical. So they can traumatize mice I'll tell one of my favorite studies because I think it'll be important to the listener who's just made aware of this work. Emory Medical School in Atlanta did this study with male mice, and they were made to fear a cherry blossom-like scent. And every time the poor little mice smelled this scent, they shocked them. So the mice began to develop in that first generation, forget about subsequent generations. In that first generation, they began to develop an epigenetic adaptation. Their brains had epigenetically adapted to protect them by creating enlarged areas where there were a greater amount of smell receptors. So the mice could detect the scent at lesser concentrations, thereby protecting them. So the researchers, they have this idea. They said, well, what's going to happen if we take some of the sperm, where they also observed the changes, and the blood, and inject it into female mice that were not shocked, and then take the other mice away so there's no learning? Well, amazingly, are the things that happened in the second and the third generation. The pups and the grandpups became jumpy and jittery just by smelling the smell without being shocked. They had an inherited distress response without directly experiencing the trauma. And then what we know from Isabelle Monsuy at the Zurich Brain Institute and all these researchers, they cause adversity to mice. One of the most common ways, which, this now takes us back to humans, is they separate baby mice from their mothers for a very short period of time, or stress the mothers out, maybe by putting them in a glass jar and bringing them back to the mice. And then the effects can be seen biologically. Here, I'm going to read you a passage here of 4 lines from my book, because they're important. In one such study, researchers prevented females from nurturing their pups for up to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. That's it. And later in life, their offspring exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. The symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. Surprisingly, some of the males did not express these behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit these behavioral changes to their female offspring. That would be like fathers going off to war and coming back numb from the trauma, and their daughters carrying their father's fight or flight or freeze responses, his shaking, his terror, his shutdown. But it's not just fathers and daughters, because inherited family trauma is an equal opportunity employer, unfortunately, and male children are equally affected by fathers and female children equally affected by mothers, as daughters by fathers or sons by mothers. And it's, as we know, it's a brand new field. And, some of the brand new studies, some of the new science, is a recent study in the Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry that looked at mothers who suffered trauma as children. And they found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. And then there's this recent Tufts University study that found that men were able to pass their anxiety through their sperm to their children. And what's cool about the study, and this is at Tufts, it's the first study to show that human sperm mirrored the same changes, the same non-coding RNA, which is one of the mechanisms, we can get into that if we need to, mechanisms found in mice that were traumatized in the labs. So I could go on and on, but I think I want to just say there's a couple cool things happening right now in new science that's going into my new book, but it's very cool. So Isabelle Monsuy, I talked about her, the one who traumatized the mice. Well, she finds out that 3 generations of these mice have inherited this freeze response. 3 generations without even traumatizing. So their brain cells showed excessive numbers of small non-coding RNA. That's one of the mechanisms. And by extracting this RNA and injecting it in mice, we're looking at a 3-generational link. Now, recently, what she's doing, which is kind of cool, she's looking at the blood from the survivors from the 2015 attack in Nice. Remember when that guy drove the van up into the promenade and killed 80 people? Well, she's taking the blood from the survivors and she's finding correlations in the blood of the traumatized mice. And she's also been taking the blood from Pakistani orphans who've lost their mothers, who've lost their parents. And again, like us, that have had maybe breaks in the attachment, unpredictable separations from our mothers. And she's finding, again, similar non-coding RNA alterations, similar biomarkers in mice and humans. Now, when we work with trauma, of course, the question is whose trauma? We don't even know. Is it my trauma? Is it my mother's? Is it my father's? But there's some of the newest research, which I keep hinting to, and I'm sorry I haven't got there yet, is that, there's good news, because of course I've given you only the bad news that, we're all in the same boat and it's sinking, which isn't true at all. What's happening here is researchers are now able to reverse these trauma symptoms in mice. And the implications are vast. Mm-hmm. So when traumatized mice are exposed to positive environments, it changes the way the DNA expresses, which is so cool. Technically, some of the research finds that it inhibits the enzymes that cause DNA methylation or histone modifications. So baptism of Monsuit, she takes the mice she traumatized, and then she puts them in positive, low-stress environments, and their trauma symptoms reverse, and their behaviors improve. And the changes in the DNA methylation, which now prevents the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. And remember the mice I talked about in that smell study where Brian Diaz, he makes them fear the cherry blossom scent? Well, he does the opposite. He makes them not fear the scent, by teaching them, by repeatedly exposing them to it and then not shocking them. So these mice no longer share the heightened sensitivity to the scent, and the sperm loses that fearful epigenetic signature that passes to future generations. And the beauty here is mice aren't the only one who benefit from positive changes, from positive experiences.
Yes, that's wonderful to hear, Mark. And I'm very curious, how can we take this knowledge and apply it in a therapeutic setting?
So beautiful, thank you. That is the lead-in, right? We've got to calm our brain's stress response, our brain's stress reaction, whether we've inherited or the trauma happened to us when we were little. So to heal, we've got to have positive experiences. And then the positive experiences that change our brain. And then we've got to practice the new feelings and the new sensations of these positive experiences. And when we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, but we also begin to stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine, GABA, serotonin. And we begin to stimulate the release of feel-good hormones in our body that we need for healing, like estrogen and oxytocin. And even the very genes involved in the body's stress reaction can begin to function in a new and improved way. So these positive experiences, like we talked about with Sarah, remember the cutter, can be experiences of receiving support and comfort, like I teach in my book. Like Sarah had from her grandparents and her father, she's now getting all this comfort and support. But they can also be feelings of compassion. They can also be feeling states of gratitude, having a generosity practice, a practice of loving kindness, practicing mindfulness, really ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy inside, because these types of experience feed the prefrontal cortex and allow us to reframe the stress response, the stress reaction. So the brain has a chance to calm down, the amygdala has a chance to downregulate. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body. We all have this great aloneness that lives in our body, from either historically or from events that happened to us when we were little. But when we reach deep into this aloneness, we can reach beneath it. There's this, what spiritually we say all oneness, aloneness, all oneness, but it's the truth. When we can practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body, we reach what's beneath, which are the sensations we experience as life-giving. Sensations like pulsing, tingling, buzzing, expanding, opening, loosening, softening, blood flowing, warmth, flow, tingling, currents, waves, however we experiencing it. And we're able to differentiate, again, what it feels like to integrate versus how we've lived for 20 years when we were disintegrated. So it's that, basically, and then how do we heal? Okay, we're able to hold a feeling state like this of pulsing for a minute, 6 times a day. A feeling like buzzing or expanding for a minute, 6 times a day. And that can be enough to calm the brain, change the brain, down-regulate the stress response.
That's wonderful to hear. And so I'm left with a curiosity about when we're having to face that dysregulation, that fragmentation, where does one find the strength to actually face that, Mark?
So we have this rapid heartbeat, and in the disintegrated state, in the fragmented state, we identify that rapid heart rate of, oh my God, I'm going to die. It's panic. But as we know, a rapid heart rate can also be excitement. It can also be love. It can be, and we haven't been able to separate from these uncomfortable sensations in the body. So, I do a practice with people, it'd be too long to do here, but when we able to be with what's fragmented in the body, and I help people find what's fragmented in the body, we can bring a hand to it and breath to it and awareness to it. And at the same time, we can do these somatic tweaks in our body, opening our mouth, softening behind our knees, loosening the pelvic floor, and being able to hold the whole of the body as a single field of energy to include what's uncomfortable and include what's comfortable. To be able to focus on the inner body as a sense that I think Eckhart Tolle coined, the inner body as a single field of energy, and being able to stay with what's inside, again, until we reach beneath, until we're able to go beneath what's uncomfortable, until we are able to experience a life-giving feeling, like, I can feel my pulsing in my body. And I might, in that moment, if I'm working with somebody, say, that's it, let's go into that pulsing as though we can ride that pulsing. Let's become the pulsing. And in that pulsing, the trauma symptoms don't feel so dire, or they've become the pulsing. And we're able to hold pulsing and stiff back, or pulsing and tightness, until all of a sudden we're able to go beneath and hold everything in its entirety. And in that way, practicing that is how we begin to pull attention away from the limbic brain, tension away from the trauma, attention, protraction really, away from the trauma brain, and bring engagement to the prefrontal cortex, because we can't be in both places at the same time. A short answer is we can't be in the trauma brain and in the prefrontal cortex at the same time. But when we start to live in the feeling states that feed the prefrontal cortex and begin to trust those states and be with those states, something big happens for us.
I have one more question about the healing process, and that is that in your book you mentioned the importance of staying attuned to the process, because if you try to, bring in an image too early, or like, it won't be as effective as if you can really stay to. Can you speak more to that? How can one develop this level of listening to be able to be so attuned to the process?
So of course, this what you're talking about is my background as a poet. And, I talk about how trauma is, and the healing of trauma is much like creating a poem, in the sense that if we arrive at an image too early, that the body's not ready to take it in. And if the language isn't precise, so, in the book, I offer a lot of healing sentences, precise, that I've worked on for so many years, that give us this exact language. And because timing in a poem is important. So I guess the best way to say it is timing, precision of language, all is important. So when we meet the image and we have language for the image, and there's a place for the image to ground in our body, then the environment becomes fertile for healing.
You also mentioned, Mark, how there are times when in the same family, you have one person that is deeply impacted by an intergenerational trauma and another person is not. Can you share, how come that is?
Yeah, the interesting thing about inherited trauma is that, there's trauma in many of our family histories, many of our family systems, but not everyone expresses inherited trauma. Why some and why not others? And of course, one of the answers would be, we don't know. And another answer would be because siblings can all experience the same trauma from a parent, but one sibling seems unscathed. The other sibling is deeply traumatized, deeply stressed. But I want to say this because it is an important question. What makes these traumas repeat? Why do some people seem to relive and others don't? What seems to anchor them? And epigenetics is just one piece of the puzzle. Embryologists have known for over 100 years that when our grandmother is 5 months pregnant with our mother, all the eggs our mother will ever have are already embedded in our mom's womb when she's 5 months of fetus. And we're one of those eggs. So there's also this biological environment we all share. And then when we add the work of Bruce Lipton, the mother's emotions can be chemically communicated to the fetus, biochemically altering the genetic expression. But the bigger question is why? What seems to anchor these traumas? What creates these repetitions? What I found is when traumas aren't talked about, when the healing is incomplete, because the pain is too great, the grief is too great, the shame, the anger, the embarrassment, all these secondary emotions that stand in the way of primary emotions, then these repetitions seem to continue when people in our family history, our father, our mother, when they're excluded, when they're rejected, basically there's not been any resolution, then aspects of these traumas show up in later generations and unconsciously will repeat the pattern and share a similar unhappiness or repeat a similar misfortune as our parents and grandparents. But the repetition itself is beautiful because in the contraction of the trauma is the seed for the expansion. And there's a wisdom here because the contraction knows that if I keep repeating, you have another chance of contraction through which another chance to find expansion. So, because, Freud, this is me, Freud observed this 100 years ago, right? When he talked about repetition compulsion, the contraction is seeking its expansion. And then the trauma finally has a chance to heal. We can be born with an anxiety or depression, it's true, and never separated from the events of the previous generation. That's true. But we can also experience, as I mentioned before, a fear or a symptom that strikes suddenly when we arrive at a certain age or hit a certain milestone or hit a certain event in our lives, what I call a triggering event. And these triggering events can be when we get married or when we get left by a partner, rejected, or here, let me tell the story because I want to tell the story. I once worked with this woman. I talk about her in the book. She loves this man and she wants to marry this man. He's just wonderful. And he's the love of her life. But as soon as she's married, she feels incredibly trapped and she can't understand it. So she shows up in my office saying, I don't get it. I love this guy, but I feel so trapped. So when we looked at her family history, the triggering event was getting married because her grandmothers, both of them, had been given away as child brides, one at 9 and one at 12, to these much older men. And these grandmothers, these little girls, lived loveless, unhappy marriages. So my clients, the triggering event is getting married, even though it's the right person. But it was interesting. I worked with both of her sisters. The other sister marries a man 40 years older, just like the grandmothers. And then the third sister, she refused to get married at all. So we have these triggering events that we need to watch out for. And, I talk about them in the book, but I'll give you a few more. We moved to a new place. Okay, so we moved to a new place, and it can even be just across town. And all of a sudden, our self-sabotaging or self-harming behavior begins, or a depression begins. And we're not connecting that we are repeating the depression of our ancestors that may have lost their land, may have been persecuted, may have been forced out of their homeland, may have been killed in their home, and that's why we moved to the United States. Another triggering event can be being rejected by our partner. And then all of a sudden, we have this grief that's insurmountable. But the rejection of our partner leaving, and this partner we only dated for 2 months or something, and we're saying, I can't live without this person, because it's taken us to a deeper grief, maybe a break in the attachment with our mother. And as you know about my work, it's not just inherited trauma work. It's also how inherited traumas limit what's available to our mothers and fathers, limit what's available to the love they received and the love they can give. So I'm also very much an attachment therapist working with attachment. And then there's other triggers. There's one, we go to have kids. Everything's cool. Life's going around great. And then we're pregnant. I remember working with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety. And I said, well, what happened? She goes, I don't know. I just have this terrible anxiety. Okay, let's slow down. When did this begin? 6 months ago. What are the events 6-7 months ago? Well, that's when I got pregnant. I said, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? One of those questions in my book. What's the worst thing that could happen to you about being pregnant? And she said, I'll harm my baby. And I said, have you ever harmed a baby? And she said, of course not. I said, has anyone in your family ever harmed a baby? And she was just about to say no. She said, oh my goodness. And she goes back to the story that they were never allowed to talk about her grandmother, who was a young mother, lit a candle, caught the curtains on fire, the house on fire, the house burned down. They couldn't get the baby out of the second floor, and the baby died. But the key here is, again, rejection, exclusion. They were never allowed to talk about it. You walked gingerly around grandma on eggshells. You never brought it up. Hence, because we don't bring these traumas up, because we don't speak them, because we don't share them, we create this fertile ground for repetition rather than this expansive ground for healing.
Thank you for all these stories. I feel like it's a lot easier for us to understand and see how this shows up in life so that we can track this better. And I would like to ask you, when you look at what's happening right now in the world, Mark, what is your biggest concern and what gives you hope?
Okay, so I tend to not shy away from traumas because I know the traumas are the seed of expansion. So I tend to even look at what's happening globally as an opportunity, right? In a sense, here we are looking at our cell phones disappearing from other people and wanting to separate from other people. And so the world says, oh, really? Really? You want to detach and have 6 foot of distance from people? Now let's show you, in a sense, what it really is like, in a sense where we have this opportunity to really be separate from people and to have to wear masks. And so there's this opportunity for us to go inside and to find ourselves, because we, in a sense, may have been lost. We may have been living a very fast-paced life. And this opportunity in the pandemic is an opportunity to go in and to look at ourselves. At least that's what I'm seeing, both in myself and in other people. And it's a chance to, and then in this trauma, because it percolates all the other traumas, now all of a sudden we have racial, historical trauma, and we have everything. Everything that can come up is coming up. So in a sense, the world is ripe for recreation. And so what gives me hope is that there are, organizations like your organization with Thomas, and organizations that are creating structure for people to do this healing work, and that we have a chance to break out of a sameness or a limited view that we had pre-COVID, and begin to expand our view. That gives me hope.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Well, I so appreciate, Mac, you having shared all this wisdom with us today. And I would like to tell our audience about the gift that you are bringing to us today. And you've offered our audience a free gift of an on-demand class titled An Unwanted Inheritance: How Generational Trauma Affects Our Financial Success. Mark, is there anything you would like to share about your gift?
Yeah, it's many of us struggle with financial solvency, struggle with holding on to our money, being able to make money, being able to feel okay with having money. And we often don't know where it's connected. So what you're going to learn through this gift is you're going to learn, I believe I touch on many, many different facets, from attachment to the poverty in our family, to those who misappropriated funds or received inheritances unjustly, and to those who got and others didn't, and to those who didn't give back. You'll go on quite a journey, and I'm glad to be there to help you take this journey.
Thank you so much, Mark. And as a reminder for our audience, this gift is going to be available during the time that Mark's talk